Hey everybody, this is going to be a quick presentation on a review of macronutrients and a little bit of digestion as well. So beginning with digestion and absorption, this of course is an image of the GI tract and the intestinal lumen. So of course all of these organs are key in digesting and absorbing all of these nutrients that we consume. So as individuals practicing culinary medicine, it's important that we understand how these organs work together to ensure that the food we eat is actually able to be absorbed and metabolized and used in the correct way. And just looking a little bit deeper into the small intestines. So, of course, this is where the majority of our nutrients are going to be absorbed. So the small intestines is key in digestion. So here we just see the role of digestive secretions and pancreatic enzymes and bile in being able to absorb those broken down nutrients into circulation or into the lymph to then pass into the bloodstream eventually. Okay, so this is moving on to the colon. Here we see our water and electrolytes, some vitamins and minerals absorbed beyond the small intestine. The big thing to do with the colon and nutrition is the microbiome. So this is where our gut flora lives, and just the insane amount of bacteria that can live in the colon and how it affects human health in many facets is pretty fascinating. So we know that the colon, the large intestine contains the colon and the rectum and the anus. Typically up to 24 hours is how long that this water and nutrients and fecal matter will live in the colon. So if we go beyond that time period, chances are we need to adjust fiber intake because we're not consuming enough fiber, and that is what's going to extend the duration before we actually can have a bowel movement. And let me just go back to this slide here. So we see that our carbohydrates are going to be broken down into our smaller disaccharides, and the brush border will be able to digest those into single monosaccharides, and that's what's going to be absorbed. Polypeptides, those are going to be broken down into specific amino acids and just short polypeptide chains that'll be absorbed, and then our short chain fatty acids can be absorbed, and then our long chain fatty acids are going to be further emulsified and then broken down so that those can be absorbed into the lymph. So I particularly wanted to come back to here because fiber is not going to be absorbed. So it's important to know that fiber does not contain calories because it's not a calorie providing nutrient because it passes through the small intestine onto the colon where it's going to create the bulk of the fecal matter. So some common digestive concerns that we see have a lot to do with GERD, ulcers, whether those can be created from medications like aspirin use, or H. pylori, a lot of issues with the pancreas and gallbladder because those have so much to do with the pancreas, with creating and releasing those digestive enzymes for protein, fat, and carbohydrate digestion, as well as the gallbladder and its role in holding on to that bile for fat digestion. So GERD is probably one of the most common digestive issues that we see in our patients. And basically what the issue is that dysfunction of the lower esophageal sphincter. It's just relaxed a little bit too much, and we do see that diet therapy can help with this, particularly in limiting alcohol, caffeine, and fat consumption. Okay, so moving on to our macronutrients. So we'll start off with carbohydrates. The recommendation for carbohydrate consumption is 45 to 65% of daily calories. And what you typically will see with my plate is the recommendation to make half of your plate whole grains and to limit added sugars to less than 10% of calories. That added sugar recommendation is actually fairly new. And the new nutrition facts label actually addresses that added sugar. So that's part of the reason why you now see that on your food label, because we actually have a guideline for it. So carbohydrates provide 4 calories per gram. Let me change that right now. 4 calories per gram. So we'll look at the calorie provisions by protein and fat as well. But here with carbohydrates, the biggest thing is that quality matters. So you'll see whole grains versus refined grains, or simple sugars versus complex sugars most of the time. So when we're comparing whole grains and refined grains, this is something that your patients are going to hear all the time. But the thing is what this means is that some of the grain is actually missing, and it's the pieces of the grain that have the fiber and that really nutrient-dense bran and germ. So B vitamins and other minerals specifically are missing from those refined grains, and of course fiber as well. And then with simple sugars versus complex sugars, your simple sugars are going to be your monosaccharides and your disaccharides, those added sugars that are in foods, versus your complex sugars that are coming from oatmeal and whole grain rice, black beans, stuff like that. So the whole grains and whether or not the grains and whether or not they're whole or refined, as well as the complexity of the carbohydrates that you're consuming, is going to affect the nutrient density. So how much fiber does it have, the micronutrient content, as well as how it affects your blood sugar. So any time that we consume something that has a greater fiber or particularly in this case fiber, it is going to slow the rate at which our blood sugar rises. So that's how certain carbohydrates that have more fiber attached to them, their glycemic index or their glycemic load is going to be lower than other carbohydrates. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. Okay, and in this image we're seeing a comparison in the quickness of how a meal is absorbed based on it being a fiber-rich meal versus a limited fiber meal. So you see that a lower fiber meal is those nutrients are going to be absorbed much more quickly than this fiber-rich meal. So that's going to have a lot to do with satiety as well, and how sort of quick those nutrients are going to be able to be taken up into the cells and be readily available. So just a quick review here of the difference between monosaccharides, disaccharides, oligosaccharides, and your polysaccharides. Just a note here, fiber again is indigestible, so it doesn't provide carbohydrate energy, but definitely is a key nutrient, especially with weight management, bowel management, and all of those things. So we have 2 different fiber types, which we'll talk to patients about. Most of the foods that you consider as being higher fiber foods are going to have a mixture of both soluble and insoluble fiber. However, we are able to make some recommendations for specific foods if a patient is experiencing diarrhea or constipation, because of the way this fiber works within the GI tract. So soluble fiber tends to gel and thicken the stool, whereas insoluble fiber really helps to increase transit time. So if somebody is constipated, if it's not like a fluid issue or an over excessive consumption of protein and inadequate water or something, if it's truly a fiber issue, insoluble fiber truly usually can help with that. Whereas if a patient isn't consuming, over consuming fiber, but they're having really loose stool, sometimes a soluble fiber can help to kind of slow things down and thicken up that stool. So beyond just with improving gut health and transit time, fiber actually plays an important role in food science because it can help us to thicken liquids for people who are on, some texture modified diets. So it plays a role in MNT consistently in helping patients with swallowing disorders. Okay, so I briefly mentioned the glycemic response and glycemic index and glycemic load. So you may have seen, some charts before that show that some foods have a higher glycemic index than others. So basically what glycemic index is a ranking of how specific foods raise the blood sugar and how quickly that happens. So that glycemic response. What glycemic load does is it takes into account the serving size. So a perfect example of this is that a lot of people think that carrots are high in sugar. Carrots are not high in sugar. They have a lot of fiber in them. So the glycemic index kind of falsely shows that carrots are high in sugar, but that's using an amount of carrots that one would never consume. So looking at the actual serving size, that glycemic load of carrots is actually a lot lower. So here it just shows you white bread that doesn't have any fiber, fat, or like protein with it, compared to kidney beans that contains a lot of fiber. It has some protein in it as well. The glycemic response is a lot slower for these kidney beans because of the nutrients that are also provided in addition to those carbohydrates. So anytime you have a meal with fat, protein, or fiber, in addition to that carbohydrate, the glycemic response is going to be lower and slower typically than a completely simple sugar meal. So hot topic now is, do carbohydrates cause people to gain weight? So carbohydrates themselves don't cause fat gain or cause people to gain weight. It's any excess energy intake beyond what energy expenditure is that causes weight gain. So there is data that suggests that these low carbohydrate diets lower insulin release, and what we know about insulin is that it basically triggers the cells to store energy, right? So usually that's going to come from fat. We're going to store energy as fat typically. So the theory is that if we consume a low carbohydrate diet, we're going to release less insulin, and that's going to cause us to store less energy. So across the board, we don't recommend low carbohydrate diets, but consistent carbohydrate diets can be really helpful for patients with diabetes or insulin resistance as well. So it doesn't have to necessarily be a low carbohydrate diet, which is also poorly defined in literature as well. So okay, so this is just an image that shows how, or just sort of proves that carbohydrate consumption isn't what is leading individuals to be overweight or obese. So here we're looking at an American population, a Chinese population, and a Japanese population. Overall, their caloric intake is pretty consistent, relative. So compare this to this. So we see the American population has an exponentially higher obesity rate than the Chinese and the Japanese population. But look at what each group is consuming in excess. So this is based on the dietary guidelines for these populations, and based on the American guidelines. So protein, Americans overconsume, whereas the Chinese are overconsuming fat, whereas the Japanese are overconsuming carbohydrates. Okay, so obviously this isn't reflecting the idea that carbohydrates cause obesity or fattening. All right, so moving on to lipids. Recommended lipid or fat consumption is 20 to 30% of total calories for the day. And here we limit saturated fat to less than 10% of daily calories. Fat itself is a higher energy nutrient, providing 9 calories per gram. So a little bit can kind of go a long way. So whenever we talk to patients, we have to help them see that the butter that they add, or even the olive oil that they add, the cheese that they add, all of that is pretty dense with fat typically. So just a little bit can add a lot of calories. And if they are an individual who has to manage calories in some way, that could be a concern. So triglycerides are the major way in which we consume and store and transport fatty acids in the body. So something that is not well understood, especially among patients, is that their consumption of simple sugars can greatly affect their serum triglyceride count. And that is because whenever we can overconsume, especially simple sugars, we have to be able to store that energy that we're not using at the time. So how do we store that energy? Typically in the form of fat, and we're going to do that in triglyceride form. So for patients, especially with diabetes or insulin resistance, a lot of times their triglyceride levels are going to be high in addition to their blood sugar. So we typically divide our lipids into chain length, and this just shows you some examples of short chain and medium chain and long chain fatty acids. But what we usually are discussing with our patients is saturated versus unsaturated fatty acids. So for a long time, our saturated fatty acids were known as unhealthy fats, and our unsaturated, monounsaturated, and polyunsaturated fatty acids were known as our healthy fats. So I like to still suggest those unsaturated fatty acids are healthy, but saturated fatty acids certainly can provide other important nutrients and help with absorption of specific vitamins, and they can be in certain foods that have a lot of other good stuff with them too. So I don't really love to ever say that something is healthy or unhealthy, but so our saturated fats are those that are going to be solid at room temperature. So typically that's going to be your animal products, so lard, butter, whereas our unsaturated fatty acids are going to be liquid at room temperature. So those are your plant sources, your canola oil, those types of things. So the biggest exception here is with our tropical oils. So coconut oil and palm oil, those are actually saturated fats, and this is where some of that question comes in. So we were always taught that saturated fats weren't healthy for us, but then coconut oil got really hot. So these are things that research needs to continue to address and look at. So the other thing that we consider with our lipids and fatty acids is the configuration, so trans fats versus cis fats. So trans fats are highly related to heart attack and stroke and cardiovascular disease in general. Typically where we find trans fatty acids is in fried foods, as well as pre-made frozen pizza crusts and pie crust, things like that. So trans fatty acids can be naturally, so certain fish can have trans fatty acids, but it's those synthetic fatty acids that are man-made that are harmful. So the reason that these were made was basically we were told fat was bad. So butter was not ideal anymore. So they wanted to take these oils and create something that tasted and cooked like butter. So they took oils, which are liquid, right? And they wanted to make those solid. So they had these unsaturated fatty acids that they chemically produced trans fatty acids with. And what that does is sort of stabilize it, increase the shelf life, and make them harder at room temperature as well. So that chemical change impacts how that trans fatty acid, or that fatty acid in general, impacts health in the body. So this shows you the fatty acid makeup of some common foods. So I'll talk to you in just a second about the omega-3 and omega-6 balance, but what you really want to look at is limited saturated fat, a bigger blue line, but also a bigger green than orange. Okay, so omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids both are polyunsaturated fat, but because omega-6 fatty acids, which you can see here, more often are going to be leading to some more inflammatory prostaglandins and prostacyclins and thromboxanes and leukotrienes, as compared to our omega-3 fatty acids making less inflammatory products. So the key here is to have a good balance of omega-3 to omega-6, and not really a balance, but a greater consumption of omega-3 fatty acids compared to omega-6 fatty acids. So a lot of modern farming and agriculture is what has caused this shift in the Western American diet. So now our livestock are primarily fed like corn-based feed, and that is going to increase their omega-6 fatty acid content of their milk and of their meat, because animals are what they eat and we are what we eat, correct? So you'll see more now omega-3 supplements, or you'll see milk that has like an omega-3 label on it, like especially this DHA, and other like butter products. You'll see they have a larger omega-3 content, and usually it's because it's like grass-fed. It doesn't mean that we should tell our patients that they need to consume like grass-fed beef or anything like that, because not only is that going to be ridiculously expensive, but it's also not available across the board. So, teaching them to simply eat like less, or eating the recommended amount of meat instead of saying less, because we eat more than typically what we should, and eating more proteins and fatty acids from our olive oils, eating more beans and legumes, all of those things. So it doesn't ever have to be cutting something out, and I'm kind of going off on a tangent here, but instead of telling patients that they need to cut something out, I always try to recommend that they add something in. So like, what is something that you can add to maybe offset this less healthy choice? So this would be a good option here. So I always like to say that lipids go beyond those basic functions of fat. So like making us warm and protecting our organs, and providing energy. So we've kind of graduated to some more intricate functions of these fatty acids. So lubrication and function of our mucous membranes, cholesterol serves as a precursor to cortisol and other sex hormones. They play a role in inflammation, like we just saw, blood pressure and blood clotting. We have to have fat to absorb fat-soluble vitamins, right? So vitamins A, D, E, and K. If we're not consuming fat with those foods, we're not going to be absorbing each of those nutrients to their full potential. So I just gave some examples of how we can kind of use this information to get more nutrition out of those foods that we're eating. So massaging kale not only makes the kale easier to chew, but it's also infusing that oil, that fat, into the kale so that those vitamins can be more readily absorbed. Similar, eating vegetables with some olive oil or salads dressed with an olive oil based dressing or avocado, anything like that. Something that provides fat is going to help us to absorb those nutrients. All right, and moving on to proteins and amino acids. Our protein recommendation is 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. So that equals to about 10 to 35% of our daily calorie consumption. So that's a pretty wide range. But this recommendation for 0.8 grams per kilogram has kind of been up for debate lately, especially in the hospital setting, with many practitioners thinking that this is awfully low. So for hospitalized patients or anybody who is in a state of growing or pregnancy or breastfeeding or trauma, anything like that, I definitely wouldn't go below like 1 or 1.2. And with certain disease states, we definitely go much higher as well. But of course, with patients who have maybe like renal conditions, or certain liver conditions, sometimes we might restrict protein just a little bit. But even since I've started practicing, we have kind of rethought how we limit protein, especially in renal and liver disease, because of how at risk those patients are for malnutrition. And what we're seeing is that the lack of protein or the limited protein is more harmful to them than giving them a little bit more. So whenever we talk about protein, the big emphasis here is animal versus plant sources for our patients. So animal sources provide a high biological value protein, so complete proteins, which you may have heard. And what that means is that they contain all of these essential amino acids. So there are some plant sources like quinoa and soybeans, of course, that contain all of those essential amino acids, but our animal sources of protein are still going to be those high biological value proteins. You can see, though, that both types of protein are going to provide iron, zinc, and calcium, and B vitamins. But what those plant sources of protein can provide are fiber and phytochemicals, which we'll talk a little bit more about phytochemicals tomorrow. But fiber and phytochemicals are, incredibly important for our gut microbiome and in inflammation as well. So incorporating plant-based proteins is really a great recommendation for patients if it's within their means. And it doesn't have to be like tofu or tempeh, but rice and beans can create a whole protein. There's lots of different types of beans, and those are very cheap typically. So those are things that we can recommend to our patients. So again, protein does way more than just help repair and build muscle, but think of all the proteins that are working in our bodies. So enzymes, transport proteins, antibodies. So all of those need amino acids from our diet to be able to be built. So on top of just mechanical movements, the formation of different hormones, protein plays in a very important role. Protein actually also helps with our fluid and acid-base balance, and that's because of the connection with albumin. So albumin sort of helps keep that water in the blood, and if albumin is really low, that water can leak into those other spaces and cause edema. So because of that, we a lot of times can see edema in patients who are very malnourished or who have very low protein stores. So protein energy malnutrition is a big concern for registered dietitians, as well as protein calorie malnutrition. But basically, protein energy malnutrition is an umbrella term. It can be either just a protein deficiency or protein and energy deficiency. So worldwide, we see these predominantly as kwashiorkor or marasmus in our underdeveloped and developing countries. So kwashiorkor, which we see here, is a pure protein deficiency, and again we see that edema in the belly because of that protein issue. Whereas marasmus is an energy and protein deficiency combined, so we see wasting and hollowing of the temporal region. We see their clavicle bones very prominent, so they just look wasted all over. Okay, so this is just some examples of different vegetarian and non-vegetarian dietary patterns. I think this is just good for you to see, so that when a patient tells you, oh, I'm a pescatarian or a lacto-ovo-vegetarian, you know that they probably eat fish and dairy and eggs, but they don't eat meat, or they eat no meat at all, but they do eat dairy, cheese, and eggs. So something good for you to take a look at. And finally, I just included this slide because whenever I was in school, we were taught complementary proteins. So rice and beans make a complete protein because rice nor beans have all of those essential amino acids, but together they have all the essential amino acids. So we were taught to pair those incomplete proteins together to make a complete protein, but now we know that that's not completely necessary. You don't have to have that in one single meal because it's not like we need both of those proteins at one time to be able to use them adequately in the body. But just having different plant-based proteins throughout the day and getting them in a variety is the important part, can provide our body with all of those amino acids, all of the essential amino acids to provide ourselves with complete proteins at the end of the day.